In this video, we'll be talking about procedural due process. Remember from the Getting Started video, the procedural due process is the requirement that the government provide a minimum level of notice and an opportunity to be heard before depriving a person of life, liberty, or property. Anytime you see a question involving a potential due process violation, the first step is to determine whether procedural or substantive due process is involved. Substantive due process asks whether what the government is doing is fair, reasonable, and aimed at achieving a legitimate government objective. Procedural due process asks whether the government is using fair procedures. This means that any procedural due process inquiry will require us to look at whether the state is providing adequate process to a particular individual in a particular case. Therefore, if the city of Baltimore passed an ordinance requiring all mentally ill people to be committed to a city institution, substantive due process would ask whether the rule is fair, reasonable, and aimed at the achievement of a legitimate governmental purpose. In other words, the question is whether the city may do this at all. Procedural due process, on the other hand, would ask whether the procedures used in any given case are fair. You probably spent a good amount of time talking about procedural due process in your civil procedure class. The requirement that courts only hear cases if they have power over a defendant, provide that defendant with adequate notice, and give the defendant an opportunity to be heard, springs from the procedural due process requirements of the Due Process Clause. To figure out what procedural due process requires, let's look back at the text of the 14th Amendment.